A week later, they meet for lunch. It is the middle of the week and she has offered to meet him someplace near his office. So he has told her to come to the building where he works. When the receptionist tells him she is waiting in the lobby, he feels the anticipation rise in his chest. All morning, he had been unable to concentrate on the elevation he was working on. He spends a few minutes showing her around, pointing out photographs of projects he has worked on, introducing her to one of the principal designers, showing her the room where the partners meet. His co-workers in the drafting room look up from their desks as she passes by. It is early November, a day on which the temperature has suddenly dropped, bringing the first true cold of the year. Outside, unprepared pedestrians scurry past unhappily, arms folded across their chests. Fallen leaves, battered and bleached, scuttle in the swirls of the pavement. Gogol has no hat or gloves. As they walk, he puts his hands into the pockets of his jacket. Maushumi, in contrast, seems enviably protected, at ease in the cold. She wears a navy wool coat, a black wool scarf at her throat, long black leather boots that zip up the sides. He takes her to an Italian restaurant where he goes from time to time with people at work to celebrate birthdays and promotions and projects well done. The entrance is a few steps below street level, the windows shielded with panels of lace. The waiter recognizes him, smiles. They are led to a small table at the back as opposed to the long one in the center that he normally sits at. Underneath the coat, he sees that she is wearing a nubbly grey suit with large buttons on the jacket and a bell-shaped skirt that stops short of her knees. "I taught today," she explains, aware that he is looking at her. She preferred to wear a suit where she taught, she says, given that her students were only a decade younger than she was. Otherwise, she feels no sense of authority. He envies her students suddenly, seeing her without fail, 3 times a week, pictures them gathered together around a table, staring at her continuously as she writes on the board. "The pastas are usually pretty good here," he says as the waiter hands them menus. "Join me for a glass of wine," she says. "I'm done for the day." "Lucky you. I have a stressful meeting to go to after this." She looks at him, closing the menu. "All the more reason for a drink," she points out cheerfully. "True," he concedes. "2 glasses of Merlot," he says when the waiter returns. She orders what he does, porcini ravioli and a salad of arugula and pears. He's nervous that she'll be disappointed by the choice, but when the food arrives, she eyes it approvingly, and she eats heartily, quickly, sopping up the leftover sauce on her plate with bread. As they drink their wine and eat their meal, he admires the light on her face, the faint, pale hairs that shine against the contours of her cheek. She speaks of her students, the topic for the dissertation she plans to write, about 20th century Francophone poets from Algeria. He tells her about his memory of the Christmas party, of her being forced to play Jingle Bells. "Do you remember that night?" he asks, hopeful that she will. "No, my mother was always forcing me to do things like that." "Do you still play?" She shakes her head. "I never wanted to learn in the first place. My mother had this fantasy, one of many. I think my mother's taking lessons now." The room is quiet again. The lunch crowd has come and gone. He looks around for the waiter, signals for the check, dismayed that their plates are empty, that the hour has passed. "She is your sister, Signore?" the waiter asks as he sets the check between them, glancing at Maushumi and then back at Gogol. "Oh no," Gogol says, shaking his head, laughing, at once insulted and oddly aroused. In a way, he realizes, it's true. They share the same coloring, the straight eyebrows, the long slender bodies, the high cheekbones, and dark hair. "You are sure?" the waiter persists. "Quite sure," Gogol says. "But you could be," the waiter says. See, there is quite a resemblance." "You think so?" Maushumi says. She appears to be at ease with the comparison, looking comically askance at Gogol. And yet he notices that some color has risen in her cheeks, whether from the wine or from self-consciousness, he doesn't know. "It's funny he should say that," she says, once they have stepped out into the cold. "What do you mean?" "Well, it's just funny to think that all our lives our parents raised us according to the illusion that we were cousins, that we were all part of some makeshift extended Bengali family, and now here we are, years later, and someone actually thinks we are related." He doesn't know what to say. The waiter's comment has discomfited him, making his attraction to Maushumi feel mildly illicit. "You're not dressed warmly enough," she observes, twisting the woolen scarf securely around her neck. "It's so damn hot in my apartment all the time," he says. "The heat just got turned on. For some reason I can never get my mind around the fact that it won't be the same temperature outside." "Don't you check the paper?" "I get it on my way to work." "I always check the weather by phone when I leave the house," Maushumi says. "You're joking." He stares at her, surprised that she should actually be the type to go to such lengths. "Please tell me you're joking." She laughs. "I don't admit that to just anyone, you know." She finishes arranging her scarf, and then, without removing her hands from it, she says, "Why don't you borrow this?" and begins to untie it again. "Please, I'm fine." He puts a hand to his throat against the knot of his tie. "Sure?" He nods, half tempted to say yes, to feel her scarf against his skin. "Well, at the very least you need a hat," she tells him. "I know a place nearby. Do you need to be back at work right away?" She leads him to a little boutique on Madison. The window is crowded with women's hats perched on grey, featureless heads with sloping necks nearly a foot long. "They have men's stuff in the back," she says. The shop is crowded with women. The back is relatively tranquil, stacks of fedoras and berets arrayed on curved wooden shelves. He picks up a fur hat, a top hat, trying them on as a joke. The glass of wine has made him tipsy. Maushumi begins rummaging through a basket. "This will be warm," she says, placing her fingers inside a thick navy cap with yellow stripes on the brim. She stretches the hat with her fingers. "What do you think?" She puts it on his head, touching his hair, his scalp. She smiles, pointing to the mirror. She watches as he studies himself. He is aware that she is looking at him rather than at his reflection. He wonders what her face looks like without her glasses, when her hair is loose. He wonders what it might be like to kiss her on the mouth. "I like it," he says. "I'll take it." She pulls it off his head quickly, spoiling his hair. "What are you doing?" "I want to buy it for you." "You don't have to do that." "I want to," she says, already heading toward the register. "It was my idea anyway. You were perfectly happy freezing to death." At the register the cashier notices Maushumi eyeing a brown wool and velvet hat decorated with feathers. "It's an exquisite piece," the cashier says, lifting carefully it off the bust. "Handmade by a woman in Spain. No two are alike. Would you like to try it?" Maushumi places it on her head. A customer compliments her. So does the cashier. "Not many women can pull off a hat like that," the cashier says. Maushumi blushes, glances at the price tag dangling from a thread on one side of her face. "I'm afraid it's out of my budget for today," she says. The cashier replaces the hat on the shelf. "Well, now you know what to get her for her birthday," she says, looking at Gogol. He puts on the new cap and they step out of the store. He is late for his meeting. If it weren't for that, he would be tempted to stay with her, to walk through the streets beside her, or disappear with her into the dark of a movie theater. The day has turned even colder, the wind more forceful, the sun a faint white patch. She walks him back to his office. For the rest of the day, throughout his meeting, and as he struggles afterward to get back to work, he thinks of her. When he leaves the office, instead of walking to the subway, he retraces the steps they had taken together earlier, past the restaurant where people are now having their dinners, and finds his way to the hat store, the sight of it lifting his spirits. It is nearly 8 o'clock, dark outside. He assumes the store will be closed, is surprised to see the lights still on inside, the grate only partly lowered. He studies the items in the window and his reflection in the glass, wearing the cap she had bought for him. Eventually he walks in. He is the only customer. He can hear the sound of a vacuum cleaner running at the rear end of the store. "I knew you'd be back," the saleswoman says as he walks through the door. She takes the brown velvet hat off the styrofoam head without his having to ask. "He was here earlier today with his girlfriend," she explains to her assistant. "Shall I wrap it for you?" "That would be great." It excites him to hear himself referred to that way. He watches as the hat is placed in a round, chocolate-colored box tied with a thick, creamy ribbon. He realizes that he has not asked the price, but without a thought he signs the receipt for $200. He takes the hat back to his apartment, hiding it at the back of his closet, even though Marshumi has never been there. He would give it to her on her birthday, in spite of the fact that he has no idea when her birthday is. And yet, he has the feeling that he has been to a few of her birthdays, and she to his. That weekend, at his parents' house, he confirms this. At night, after his mother and Sonia have gone up to bed, he hunts for her in the photo albums that his mother has assembled over the years. Marshumi is there, lined up behind a blazing cake in his parents' dining room. She is looking away, a pointed paper hat on her head. He stares straight at the lens, the knife in his hand, poised for the camera's benefit over the cake, his face shining with impending adolescence. He tries to peel the image from the sticky yellow backing to show her the next time he sees her, but it clings stubbornly, refusing to detach cleanly from the past. The following weekend, she invites him over for dinner at her place. She has to come downstairs in order to let him into the building. The buzzer is broken. She had warned him when they had made their plans. "Nice cap," she says. She wears a sleeveless black dress, tied loosely at the back. Her legs are bare, her feet slim, her toenails exposed at the top of her sandals, painted maroon. Strands of hair have come loose from her chignon. She holds half a cigarette between her fingers, but just before she leans forward to kiss him on the cheeks, she lets it drop and crushes it with the toe of her sandal. She leads him up the steps to an apartment on the 3rd floor. She has left the door open. The apartment smells strongly of cooking. On the stove, a few large pieces of chicken are browning in a pan full of oil. Music is playing, a man singing songs in French. Gogol gives her a bunch of sunflowers whose massive stems are heavier in his arms than the bottle of wine he has also brought. She does not know where to put the flowers. The countertops, limited to begin with, are crammed with evidence of the meal she is preparing. Onions and mushrooms, flour, a stick of butter wrap idly softening in the heat. A glass of wine she is in the process of drinking. Plastic grocery bags she has not had the time to put away. "I should have bought something more manageable," he says, as she looks around the kitchen, the flowers resting against her shoulder, as if expecting a surface to miraculously clear. "I've been meaning for some weeks to buy myself some sunflowers," she says. She glances quickly at the pan on the stove and takes him through the kitchen and into the living room. She unwraps the flowers. "There is a vase up there," she says, pointing to the top of a bookcase. "Would you mind getting it down?" She carries the vase into the bathroom, and he can hear water running into the tub. He takes the opportunity to remove his coat and cap, drape them over the back of the sofa. He has dressed with care, a blue and white striped Italian shirt that Sonia had bought for him at Philine's basement, a pair of black jeans. She returns and fills the vase with flowers, putting it on the coffee table. The place is nicer than he expected, from the grimy look of the lobby. The floors had been redone, the walls freshly painted, the ceiling dotted with track lights. The living room has a square dining table in one corner, and a desk and file cabinets set up in another. 3 particle board bookcases line one wall. On the dining table there is a pepper mill, a salt cellar, bright, clear-skinned, clementines arranged in a bowl. He recognizes versions of things he knows from home: a Kashmiri crevel-work carpet on the floor, Rajasthani silk pillows on the sofa, a cast-iron Natraj on one of the bookcases. Back in the kitchen, she sets out some olives and some goat cheese coated with ash. She hands him a corkscrew and asks him to open the bottle he has brought, to pour himself a glass. She dredges more of the chicken on a plate of flour. The pan is sputtering loudly and has showered the wall behind the stove with oil. He stands there as she refers to a cookbook by Julia Child. He is overwhelmed by the production taking place for his benefit. In spite of the meals they have already shared, he is nervous about eating with her. "When would you like to eat?" she says. "Are you hungry?" "Whenever. What are you making?" She looks at him doubtfully. "Coco Win. I haven't made it before. I just found out that you are supposed to cook it 24 hours in advance. I'm afraid I'm running a bit behind." He shrugs. "It already smells great. I'll help you." He rolls up his sleeves. "What can I do?" "Let's see," she says, reading. "Oh, okay. You can take those onions and make X's in the bottom with a knife and drop them into that pan." "In with the chicken?" "No, shoot." She kneels down and retrieves a pot from one of the lower cupboards. "In here. They need to boil for a minute, and then you take them out." He does as he is told, filling the pan with water and turning on the flame. He finds a knife and scores the onions, as he has had once been taught to do with Brussels sprouts in the Radcliffe's kitchen. He watches her measure wine and tomato paste into the pan containing the chicken. She searches in the cupboard for a stainless steel spice caddy and throws in a bay leaf. "Of course, my mother is appalled that I'm not making you Indian food," she says, studying the contents of the pan. You told her I was coming over? She happened to call today. Then she asks him, "What about you? Have you been giving your mother updates?" I haven't gone out of my way, but she probably suspects something, given that it's a Saturday and I'm not at home with her and Sonia. Maushumi leans over the pan, watching the contents come to a simmer, prodding the pieces of chicken with a wooden spoon. She glances back at the recipe. "I think I need to add more liquid," she says, pouring water from a tea kettle into the pan, causing her glasses to steam. "I can't see," she laughs, stepping away so that she stands a bit closer to him. The CD has ended and the apartment is silent, apart from the sounds on the stove. She turns to him, still laughing, her eyes still obscured. She holds up her hands, messy from cooking, coated with flour and chicken fat. "Would you mind taking these off for me?" With both hands he pries the glasses from her face, clasping the frames where they meet her temples. He puts them on the counter, and then he leans over and kisses her. He touches his fingers to her bare arms, cool in spite of the warmth of the kitchen. He presses her close, a hand at the small of her back, against the knot of her dress, tasting the warm, slightly sour tang of her mouth. They make their way through the living room to the bedroom. He sees a box spring and mattress without a frame. He unties the knot at the back of her dress with difficulty, then swiftly undoes the long zipper, leaving a small black pool at her feet. In the light cast from the living room, he glimpses black mesh underwear and a matching bra. She is curvier than she appeared clothed, her breasts fuller, her lips generously flared. They make love on top of the covers, quickly, efficiently, as if they have known each other's bodies for years. But when they are finished, she switches on the lamp by her bed and examines each other, quietly discovering moles and marks and ribs. "Who would have thought?" she says, her voice tired, satisfied. She is smiling, her eyes partly closed. He looks down at her face. "You're beautiful." "And you." "Can you even see me without those glasses?" "Only if you stay close," she says. "Then I'd better not move." "Don't." They peel back the covers and lie together, sticky and spent, in each other's arms. He begins to kiss her again, and she wraps her legs around him. But the smell of something burning causes them to bolt naked from the bed, rushing comically to the kitchen, laughing. The sauce has evaporated and the chicken is irreparably scorched, so much so that the pan itself has to be thrown away. By then they are starving, and because they lack the energy to either to go out or to prepare another meal, they end up ordering in, feeding each other tiny wedges of clementines as they wait for Chinese food to arrive. Within 3 months, they have clothes and toothbrushes at each other's apartments. He sees her for entire weekends without makeup, sees her with grey shadows under her eyes as she types papers at her desk, and when he kisses her head, he tastes the oil that accumulates on her scalp between shampoos. He sees the hair that grows on her legs between waxings, the black roots that emerge between appointments at the salon, and in these moments, these glimpses, he believes he has known no greater intimacy. He learns that she sleeps, always, with her left leg straight and her right leg bent, ankle over knee, in the shape of a 4. He learns that she is prone to snoring, ever so faintly, sounding like a lawn mower that will not start, and to gnashing her jaws, which he massages for her as she sleeps. At restaurants and bars they sometimes slip Bengali phrases into their conversation in order to comment with impunity at another diner's unfortunate hair or shoes. They talk endlessly about how they know and do not know each other. In a way, there is little to explain. There had been the same parties to attend when they were growing up, the same episodes of The Love Boat and Fantasy Island. The children watched as the parents feasted in another part of the house. The same meals served to them on paper plates. The carpets lined with newspapers when the hosts happened to be particularly fastidious. He can imagine her life, even after she and her family moved away to New Jersey. Easily. He can imagine the large suburban house her family owned, the china cabinet in the dining room her mother's prized possession, the large public high school in which she had excelled, but that she had miserably attended. There had been the same frequent trips to Calcutta, being plucked out of their American lives for months at a time. They calculate the many months that they were in that distant city together, on trips that had overlapped by weeks and once by months, unaware of each other's presence. They talk about how they are both routinely assumed to be Greek, Egyptian, Mexican. Even in this misrendering they are joined. She speaks with nostalgia of the years her family had spent in England, living at first in London, which she barely remembers, and then in a brick, semi-detached house in Croydon, with rose bushes in front. She describes the narrow house, the gas fireplaces, the dank odor of the bathrooms, eating Weetabix and hot milk for breakfast, wearing a uniform to school. She tells him that she has hated moving to America, that she had held on to her British accent for as long as she could. For some reason, her parents feared America much more than England, perhaps because of its vastness, or perhaps in their minds it had less of a link to India. A few months before their arrival in Massachusetts, a child had disappeared while playing in his yard and was never found. For a long time afterward, there were posters in the supermarket. She remembers always having to call her mother every time she and her friends moved to another house in the neighborhood. a house visible from her own, to play with another girl's toys, to have another family's cookies and punch. She would have to excuse herself upon entering and ask for the telephone. The American mothers were at once charmed and perplexed by her sense of duty. "I'm at Anna's house," she would report to her mother in English. "I'm at Sue's." He does not feel insulted when she tells him that for most of her life he was exactly the sort of person she had sought to avoid. If anything, it flatters him. From earliest girlhood, she says, she had been determined not to allow her parents to have a hand in her marriage. She had always been admonished not to marry an American, and as had he, but he gathers that in her case these warnings had been relentless, and had therefore plagued her far more than they had him. When she was only 5 years old, she was asked by her relatives if she planned to get married in a red sari or a white gown. Though she had refused to indulge them, she knew, even then, what the correct response was. By the time she was 12, she had made a pact with 2 other Bengali girls she knew, never to marry a Bengali man. They had written a statement vowing never to do so, and spit on it at the same time, and buried it somewhere in her parents' backyard. From the onset of adolescence, she had been subjected to a series of unsuccessful schemes. Every so often a small group of unmarried Bengali men materialized in the house, young colleagues of her father's. She never spoke to them. She strutted upstairs with the excuse of homework, and did not come downstairs to say goodbye. During summer visits to Calcutta, strange men mysteriously appeared in the sitting room of her grandparents' flat. Once on a train to Durgapur to visit an uncle, a couple had been bold enough to ask her parents if she was engaged. They had a son doing his surgical residency in Michigan. "Aren't you going to arrange a wedding for her?" relatives would ask her parents. Their inquiries had filled her with a cold dread. She hated the way they would talk of the details of her wedding, the menu and the different colors of saris she would wear for the different ceremonies, as if it were a fixed certainty in her life. She hated when her grandmother would unlock her almari, showing her which jewels would be hers when the day came. The shameful truth was that she was not involved, was in fact desperately lonely. She had rebuffed the Indian men she wasn't interested in, and she had been forbidden as a teenager to date. In college, she had harbored lengthy infatuations with students with whom she never spoke, with professors and TAs. In her mind, she would have relationships with these men, structuring her days around chance meetings in the library, or a conversation during office hours, or the one class she and a fellow student shared, so that even now she associated a particular year of college with the man or boy she had silently, faithfully, absurdly desired. Occasionally one of her infatuations would culminate in a lunch or a coffee date, an encounter on which she would pin all her hopes, but which would lead to nothing. In reality, there had been no one, so that toward the end of college, as graduation loomed, she was convinced in her bones that there would be no one at all. Sometimes she wondered if it was her horror of being married to someone she didn't love that had caused her, subconsciously, to shut herself off. She shakes her head as she speaks, irritated with having revisited this aspect of her past. Even now she regrets herself as a teenager. She regrets her obedience, her long, unstyled hair, her piano lessons and lace-collared shirts. She regrets her mortifying lack of confidence, the extra 10 pounds she carried on her frame during puberty. "No wonder you never talked to me back then," she says. He feels tenderness towards her when she disparages herself this way, and though he had witnessed that stage of her himself, he can no longer picture it. Those vague recollections of her he has carried with him all his life have been wiped clean, replaced by the woman he knows now. At Brown, her rebellion had been academic. At her parents' insistence, she had majored in chemistry, for they were hopeful she would follow in her father's footsteps. Without telling them, she had pursued a double major in French, immersing herself in a third language, a third culture. Had been her refuge. She approached French, unlike things American or Indian, without guilt, or misgiving, or expectation of any kind. It was easier to turn her back on the two countries that could claim her, in favor of the one that had no claim whatsoever. Her 4 years of secret study had prepared her at the end of college to escape as far as possible. She told her parents she had no intention of being a chemist, and, deaf to their protests, she had scraped together all the money she had and moved to Paris with no specific plans. Suddenly it was easy, and after years of being convinced she would never have a lover, she began to fall effortlessly into affairs. With no hesitation she had allowed men to seduce her in cafes, in parks, while she gazed at paintings in museums. She gave herself openly, completely, not caring about the consequences. She was exactly the same person, looked and behaved the same way, and yet, suddenly, in a new city, she was transformed into the kind of girl she had once envied, had believed she would never become. She allowed the men to buy her drinks, dinners, later to take her in taxis to their apartments, in neighborhoods she had not yet discovered on her own. In retrospect, she saw that her sudden lack of inhibition had intoxicated her more than any of the men had. Some of them had been married, far older, fathers to children in secondary school. The men had been French for the most part, but also German, Persian, Italian, Lebanese. There were days she slept with one man after lunch, another after dinner. They were a bit excessive, she tells Gogol with a roll of her eyes, the type to lavish her with perfume and jewels. She found a job working for an agency, helping American business people learn conversational French, and French business people learn conversational English. She would meet with them in cafes or speak with them by phone, asking questions about their families, their backgrounds, their favorite books and foods. She began to socialize with other American expatriates. Her fiancé was part of that crowd. He was an investment banker from New York, living in Paris for a year. His name was Graham. She had fallen in love and very quickly moved in with him. It was for Graham that she had applied to NYU. They took a place together on York Avenue. They lived there in secret, with 2 telephone lines, so that her parents would never know. When her parents came to the city, he'd disappear to a hotel, removing all traces of himself from the apartment. It had been exciting at first, maintaining such an elaborate lie, but then it had gotten tiresome, impossible. She brought him home to New Jersey, prepared herself for battle, but in fact, to her enormous surprise, her parents were relieved. By then, she was old enough so that it didn't matter to them that he was an American. Enough of their friends had children, had married Americans, had produced pale, dark-haired, half-American grandchildren, and none of it was as terrible as they had feared. And so, her parents did their best to accept him. They told their Bengali friends that Graham was well-behaved, Ivy educated, earned an impressive salary. They learned to overlook the fact that his parents were divorced, that his father had remarried not once but twice, and his second wife was only 10 years older than Maushumi. One night, in a taxi stuck in midtown traffic, she had impulsively asked him to marry her. Looking back on it, she supposed it was all those years of people attempting to claim her, choose her, of feeling an invisible net cast around her, that had led her to this proposal. Graham had accepted, gave her his grandmother's diamond. He had agreed to fly with her and her parents to Calcutta to meet her extended family and ask for her grandparents' blessing. He had charmed them all, learned to sit on the floor and eat with his fingers, take the dust from her grandparents' feet. He had visited the homes of dozens of her relatives, eaten the plates full of syrupy mishti, patiently posed for countless photographs on rooftops, surrounded by her cousins. He had agreed to a Hindu wedding, and so she and her mother had gone shopping in Garyahat and Newmarket, selected dozens of saris, gold jewelry in red cases with purple velvet linings, a dhoti and a topor for Graham, and that her mother had carried by hand on the plane ride back. The wedding was planned for summer in New Jersey, an engagement party thrown, a few gifts already received. Her mother had typed up an explanation of Bengali wedding rituals on the computer and mailed it to all the Americans on the guest list. A photograph of the 2 of them was taken for the local paper in her parents' town. A few weeks before the wedding, they were out to dinner with friends, getting happily drunk, and she heard Graham talking about their time in Calcutta. To her surprise, he was complaining about it, commenting that he found it taxing, found the culture repressed. All they did was visit her relatives, he said. Though he thought the city was fascinating, the society, in his opinion, was somewhat provincial. People tended to stay at home most of the time. There was nothing to drink. Imagine dealing with the 50 in-laws without alcohol. I couldn't even hold her hand on the street without attracting stares, he had said. She had listened to him, partly sympathetic, partly horrified. For it was one thing for her to reject her background, to be critical of her family's heritage, another to hear it from him. She realized that he had fooled everyone, including her. On their walk home from the restaurant, she brought it up, saying that his comments had upset her. Why hadn't he told her these things? Was he only pretending to enjoy himself all that time? They had begun to argue, a chasm opening up between them, swallowing them, and suddenly, in a rage, she had removed his grandmother's ring from her finger and tossed it into the street, into oncoming traffic. And then Graham had struck her on the face as pedestrians watched. By the end of the week, he had moved out of the apartment they shared. She stopped going to school, filed for incompletes in all her classes. She swallowed half a bottle of pills, was forced to drink charcoal in an emergency room. She was given a referral to a therapist. She called her advisor at NYU, told him she had had a nervous breakdown, took off the rest of the semester. The wedding was cancelled, hundreds of phone calls made. They lost the deposit they had paid to Shah Jahan caterers, as well as to their honeymoon destination, Palace on Wheels. The gold was taken to a bank vault, the saris and blouses and petticoats put away in a moth-proof box. Her first impulse was to move back to Paris, but she was in school, too invested to drop out, and besides, she had no money for that. She fled the apartment on York Avenue, unable to afford it on her own. She refused to go home to her parents. Some friends in Brooklyn took her in. It was painful, she told him, living with a couple at that particular time, listening to them shower together in the mornings, watching them kiss and shut the door to their bedroom at the end of each night. But in the beginning, she could not face being alone. She started temping. By the time she had saved enough to move to her own place in the East Village, she was thankful to be alone. All summer she went to movies by herself, sometimes as many as 3 a day. She bought TV Guide every week and read it from cover to cover, planning her nights around her favorite shows. She began to subsist on a diet of raita and Triscuits. She grew thinner than she had ever been in her life, so that, in a few pictures taken of her in that period, her face is faintly unrecognizable. She went to end-of-summer sales and bought everything in a size 4. 6 months later, she would be forced to donate it all to a thrift shop. When autumn came, she threw herself into her studies, catching up on all the work she had abandoned. That spring began every now and then to date. And then, one day, her mother called, asking if she remembered a boy named Gogol.